My task was this morning to consider the role of scholars in Library 2.0. And of course, Blair asked me if I'd talk about books, since I have a relationship with the MIT Press and some of MIT's other publishing activities. But I'm no more obedient than anybody else on this panel or anybody else that you'll hear from today. So what I thought I'd talk about is something that's more interesting to me than that, because I think books are actually an exceptionally mature and reliable way of placing ideas in a stable format and conducting an extended argument in a genre that people are well acquainted with and know how to use. Whether they're formatted in terms of a hard copy ink on paper or whether they're formatted for electronic delivery, they are still books and people recognize them. The real problem that publishers of books are having these days is not that books aren't a wonderful medium for what they set out to do, but it's rather that John Palfrey's students aren't reading extended arguments anymore. And so the question of the survivability of books has more to do with whether we continue to train people to value and read books as a way of thinking than it has to do with whether books themselves are an appropriate genre for the extended argument. So I thought I'd talk this morning a little bit about a discussion that was held among the faculty at MIT that began in August of 2008 that relates to the topic that John raised in response to the last question. MIT faculty, although you might remember that it began as a technical school, MIT faculty actually represent virtually every discipline that you'll find in a contemporary university. We don't have a law school and we don't have a medical school, but we have a lot of the other same disciplines that any other institution has. And after the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard and the law school at Harvard passed resolutions regarding the contribution of the open access of the works of the faculty in those two schools at Harvard, the faculty chairman at MIT got a lot of requests from faculty to ask whether MIT faculty shouldn't consider doing something along the same lines. So in September of 2008, the faculty chairman convened a interdisciplinary, cross-school, multi-department, 12-member ad hoc faculty committee to consider the question of how MIT faculty publish their work, what they do with the scholarly publications they use, how that work should be disseminated, and to pay particular attention to the possibility of providing open access to those publications. The intent of the charge to the committee, which I co-chaired with my, oh, Peter, isn't he good? Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you. How many librarians does it take to make a PowerPoint slide work? So the faculty, let me see, here we go. They put it on the, all right. They put it on the MacBook, that's why it's working. So the faculty began its work in September, and a number of interesting aspects of the way faculty consider their role in the dissemination of scholarly work and new research became quite vividly available as a result of the conversations that we were having, first in the committee and then with the faculty as a whole. It's safe to say that the mental model that virtually every faculty member has is the one that's in front of you. Libraries are traditional. As far as they were concerned, they wrote books and journal articles. Those things were purchased by libraries. They were held in unaltered and persistent ways, and everybody lived happily ever after. They were not the least bit confused by the fact that on a day-to-day basis, they worked in an entirely different way than that. that many of them said quite proudly that they hadn't actually set foot in the library for quite a long time, thank you very much, and they were fully connected, no matter where they were, by magic, to a sophisticated network of information resources that provided everything that they need at all times. But it was really important that we still have all those stacks in those books, because that's where their work was persistently archived. Another thing that we learned is that each individual faculty member lived in complete and total confidence that the world of scholarly communication worked exactly as their discipline worked. So the historians were quite sure that biologists worked in exactly the same way they did. The physicists were absolutely positive that mathematicians were working as they did. Every discipline believed that the process by which new knowledge is created and committed to some kind of a communications medium and made persistently available and affordable to the people who needed to use it, that everybody did things exactly like they did. Well, of course, we know perfectly well that that's not the least bit true, and that each discipline has its own traditions and practices and pursues those with considerable vigor. So as we carried out the discussions, first within the committee and then across the institution, the committee ended up visiting every department in every school at MIT at one point to have a conversation with the faculty about their perceptions. And 5 vivid themes emerged from those conversations, which informed the resolution that MIT ultimately passed. Faculty were increasingly concerned about the fact that copyright transfer agreements that they were being asked to sign made it difficult, if not impossible, for them to use their own work. This was deeply concerning to people. Nevertheless, they did exactly what they wanted with their own work, and their attitude was the so sue me model of distribution of work. But where this problem came home to them was in their open courseware sites, because faculty at MIT quite proudly contribute their courses to the open courseware site. And what they discovered is they were contributing all of their substantively rich intellectual works to open courseware, and when they went and visited the site, they were gutted. Anything that had copyright constraints on it had to get stripped out from the open courseware site. And so they called open courseware to complain, and open courseware said, we couldn't get permission. And so the faculty called their own publishers, and they said, what are you doing? What are you thinking? It's my stuff. I want to put it up on open courseware. And the publisher said, I don't think so. I own that. Go read the agreement that you signed. I own that, and you can't use it. So it was quite shocking, I think, to faculty to realize the extent to which they had signed over agreements that no longer let them legally use their own work. A second theme that emerged from the discussions was that it turns out that those who own the copyrighted content, were increasingly asking the MIT libraries to sign license agreements for the use of that material that were totally in conflict with the way the academy teaches and conducts research. We were being asked to sign license agreements for one school and not another in an interdisciplinary environment. The faculty were astonished. We were being told that administrative staff couldn't use materials that we were bringing in for educational purposes. We were told that laboratories that are affiliated with MIT couldn't use resources because they were more than 2 miles away. Totally arbitrary distinction. We were being asked to sign license agreements that said that visitors, visiting scholars, visiting students couldn't use the resources that we were licensing. And the faculty were just absolutely astonished that they had found themselves in a position where they gave away their work for reasons of communication and scholarship, and suddenly the license agreements were not only expensive, but they were seeking to constrain who could use their work. A third theme that emerged that shocked them equally badly was the vulnerability of the electronic assets. The electronic library that you saw, Library 2.0, is actually a library for rent. If you have enough money to live in the penthouse, you can rent access to these resources, but when you stop paying, you get evicted. And students increasingly are learning that as they work in rich environments like Yale and MIT and Harvard and elsewhere, that when they leave their institutions, they lose all access to the deep, rich resources that have been electronically available to them, and they fall off the edge of the earth. And then the last theme, of course, is that they had no idea how much consolidation had gone on in the publishing world. The set of small circles under 1998 show 8 key players, which by 2008 had converged into 4 key players. And the faculty started talking about this slide as the Death Star slide. Because you can see one by one the commercial publishers are being sucked into the big red blob in the middle. And you may have heard on Monday that Springer has put its titles up for sale. So it will be interesting to see where they land. So as faculty looked at this kind of an environment, they were saying to themselves, oh my gosh, this is really unbelievable. So I'm like this little dot down the bottom, and I'm trying to negotiate a license agreement. To John's point, I'm trying to negotiate a license agreement with a Death Star. Good luck to me and the Red Sox is all I can say. And then finally, the last thing that emerged was that they can't do data mining. And for the first time, I think it came home to them why the National Institutes of Health has asked their principal investigators to make articles available to them, one of the purposes of which is to do data mining. And the faculty suddenly were realizing that the kinds of research projects that they wanted to do that involved data mining across corpuses of information were illegal. And in fact, if you read the Google book search settlement agreement that's proposed, you will see that Google also retains total control over who gets to do data mining in the corpus. So as a research tool, these great bodies of information that are digitally formatted have tremendous possibility for research projects, but you can't do it without their permission, and indeed Google is going to make sure nobody can do it without theirs. So out of these discussions came a really important consideration, which is basically that the system of journal publishing is completely out of balance. It pits one individual author against an enormous, monolithic, international, multidisciplinary publishing agreement. And the faculty don't stand a chance, even if they wanted to change things. So the faculty concluded that it would be much better, again to John's point, to think about a collective action. And when they pondered how best to do that, they decided that one thing they could do, you know, Mother Harvard, was that they could bring Daddy MIT to the table. Because from their point of view, although Elsevier is a $9 billion enterprise, MIT is a $2 billion enterprise, and that makes them a little bit bigger than some other places. And if they thought, well, you know, if Harvard's going there, they're a pretty big enterprise, and MIT, pretty soon you have enough weight on your side of the table that you can get serious attention. So on March 18th, the faculty of MIT passed an open access policy, which benefited greatly from the learnings that went on at Harvard. It's a little different, you'll see. Like the Harvard resolution, it's based on principle, the commitment to disseminate research and scholarship as widely as possible. It gives MIT non-exclusive permission to make available scholarly articles, not books, just works that are written with no expectation of compensation to further the interests of a discipline or area of scholarly research. And it gives MIT the right to exercise the copyright in those articles for the purpose of open dissemination, provided the articles are not sold for a profit. The policy applies to all scholarly articles written while the person is a member of the faculty, so it starts on March 18th and goes forward. It's not retrospective. And the provost or the provost designee, which happens to be me, I get to waive application automatically as long as I get written notification and the author tells me why they're opting out. Now, the reason we're collecting information about why people opt out is not because we don't want them to opt out, but we think over time we'll build a database of the reasons why people are unable to participate. Each faculty member makes an electronic copy available. It doesn't say that the faculty member deposits, it just says it makes it available. So that enables us, for instance, to look for those copies on a faculty member's website, scrape them and dump them in DSpace, which is where we're running them. And it gives us the opportunity to make these scholarly articles available in an open access repository, which we already have. And we actually have a few items in the DSpace environment already. So the policy takes effect immediately, but there's a cycle back to the faculty to review it. Policy issues are decided by a standing committee of the faculty. And most importantly, the faculty committee that is responsible for this is to make it as convenient for the faculty as possible. So we did learn from Harvard that if you put an aggravation layer in between the faculty and what you're trying to accomplish, it makes it a lot harder to get there. So in summary, I think what we learned from the discussions that we had with faculty is MIT faculty, at least, are pretty sophisticated about the book contracts that they sign. They don't expect to get rich on them, but they understand that environment pretty well. They were shocked to find out that the termites had gotten into the scholarly literature, scholarly journal literature, and that, in fact, although it looked beautiful and solid on the outside, it had been completely hollowed out on the inside by virtue of one drop at a time, one little termite at a time, taking the wood out of the middle of the post. And there's a shell around what a library looks like on the journal side now that's completely empty unless you throw money at publishers. So faculty want to increase open access. They think that we have a process in place where they can act as a body and not just as individuals. And they've decided to pursue this path by giving MIT, the institution, the authority that's necessary to work on behalf of faculty to preserve and share the record. And there's obviously a key role for libraries in that. And I thank you for your attention.
Okay, so Charles Greenberg will wrap it up here. Yes. I'm sorry, Charles Cronin.
My two files. No. Right. Here it is.
This one?
Yep.
And this is your file right here, right?
Fantastic. And I just great. Excellent.
Slideshow.
Now what do I do to get up?
There you go. Yesterday on Charlie Rose, the Ada Louise Huxtable was being interviewed, and at the end of the interview, Charlie Rose asked her, "What will New York City look like in the future?" And she demurred and said, "I'm not a futurist. I'm an optimist," and that's pretty much the way I'm approaching the question of Library 2.0. And I do find that the more specific our predictions on these matters, the less prescient they appear down the line. This is all by way of caution in terms of what I'm going to be talking about, which is of a very generalized nature, some comments on the public or municipal library. I'm taking a, I think, much-deserved break from academic libraries. In her essay, Hours in a Library, Virginia Woolf identified two types of readers. Quoting Virginia Woolf, "A learned man is sedentary, concentrated, solitary enthusiast who searches through books to discover some particular grain of truth upon which he has set his heart. If the passion for reading conquers him, his gains dwindle and vanish between his fingers. A reader, on the other hand," and by this I think she means a more general, a generalized reader, "must check the desire for learning at the outset. If knowledge sticks to him, well and good. But to go in pursuit of it, to read on a system, to become a specialist or an authority, is very apt to kill what it suits us to consider the more humane passion for pure and disinterested reading. If we extrapolate from Woolf, we can identify two types of libraries that roughly correspond to her. On one hand, the searching, acquisitive reader, and on the other, what I'm calling the more hedonically oriented reader, whose delectation derives as much from the artfulness of the writing as from the factual information it conveys. And these are, of course, the academic, research, university, library, and secondly, what we commonly know as the municipal or public library. And of course, there are hybrids like the Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles libraries. Those with access to research libraries can easily pivot between their roles as the searching, acquisitive readers, getting the most recent economics and medical research, or as hedonic readers, obtaining the most recent titles, fiction titles from the New York Times bestseller list. But those whose access is limited to public libraries have less flexibility in this regard and find it much more difficult than do those with access to academic libraries to morph from the hedonic reader into a successful, acquisitive, searching reader. Practically all libraries have as a primary, if not the primary goal, or even exclusive mission, to promote reading by the distribution of works of authorship whose primary purpose is to be read. And by reading, I mean the cognitive process of understanding a written linguistic message, particularly through verbal or musical symbols. And libraries have historically privileged symbolic works, literary and to a lesser extent musical works, and rightly so, I believe, because these works allow for the transmission and understanding of the most complex information to the greatest number of readers. It's possible to read tea leaves. Anybody know what the language of tea leaves, tea leaf reading is? It's tassography, and to read flower arrangements. This one's much easier. What's the word for the language of flowers? Is floriography. But for obvious reasons, libraries don't collect or circulate tea leaves or flower arrangements. So let's talk a little bit about the public library of the present, but before we get there, let's talk about the public library of the past, and in particular, my past. This is a picture of the first library I knew as a toddler. When I showed this image to my wife, she said, "I didn't know you grew up in Alabama." But I didn't. Actually, this is, believe it or not, in Washington, D.C., about half a mile from Georgetown, and the building still exists. This photo was, to be fair, taken in 1928. But in the Johnson era, when I knew it, it looked exactly like this, and still does. It's now called the Discovery Creek Museum, I believe, and it's on MacArthur Boulevard in Washington. It was one room with a librarian's desk and a bunch of books. That's it. It was a place where you visited to borrow books to read elsewhere. Sort of a kind of a homespun version of the Carnegie aspirational libraries, in which the populace at large was encouraged to read themselves towards a better existence. For the past 40 years, there's been, I think, in what I call sort of an identity crisis for the public library, principally in reaction to technological and social changes. Public libraries today struggle not only to adapt to new technologies, but also to the relatively new presumption. Thank you. To the relatively new presumption that libraries will provide content for all of them. I'm from just south of Los Angeles in a city called Newport Beach, which has a magnificent library. And in Newport Beach Public Library, of the 1.7 million circulation transactions last year, 750,000 of them were for feature films. So over 40% for feature films. It's very interesting when you think about technology. Back about 100 years or so ago, piano rolls were enormously popular, sort of the iPod of the turn of the century, the way people obtained new musical works and heard new musical works. But by and large, public libraries did not systematically collect or distribute piano rolls because these were considered essentially works of entertainment. The exodus by literate and affluent families from large cities to the suburbs between the 1960s and 90s and the commensurate flagging of tax revenues contributed to the creeping, many would say galloping, desuetude of urban public libraries. Since then, these libraries have struggled to remain viable, attempting to attract visitors and funds, obviously, by being all things to all people through programs and services far outside those of the traditional public library. But I believe that this reallocation of human and physical resources has compromised the efficacy of the public library as a place devoted to readers, as a place of human aspiration. And let's go back to the Newport Beach Public Library for just a second. I mentioned that it's an absolutely magnificent building. It's fabulously funded, fabulous tax base, has a wonderful, large, informed, polite, helpful staff. It's teeming with people. It's like Costco on a weekend. It's just people pouring in and out. There are hundreds of beautiful blonde wood private desks, indoor, outdoor reading areas, acres of computer terminals. In other words, what's not to like, or as Chico Marx would say, was a problem for you. Was a problem for me is that no one is using the library's information resources. The computer terminals, I do occasional sort of snoops through the 2 floors of the library, just out of curiosity and just to kind of very non-scientific field research. The computer terminals, I would say 9 out of 10 were being used, all of which were perfectly functional, which is unusual for a public library. But computer terminals were 9 out of 10 were being used either for email or for online shopping, from what I could tell, or looking at real estate. The reading areas, the adult serious reading that was going on, were being used by people to fill out their tax returns, studying for real estate certification exams, high school homework. They were all actually goofing off, but theoretically there to do their high school homework. And then you, of course, find 1 or 2 homeless or deranged people furtively sleeping or washing up in the bathrooms, lending a frisson of disquiet to the entire operation. What this trying to be all things to all people has done, of course, is diverted funds from the library's primary mission of promoting reading. If you look at Los Angeles Public Library, for instance, which has a budget of $124 million last year, only $10 million of that is spent on acquisitions. $7 million of that is spent for what is roughly called cultural programs, and this involves exhibitions, the library store, and library awareness programs, which I find very mysterious. You can't get access to information that I take for granted and use constantly through JSTOR. No access to JSTOR, whatever. No access to ArtStore. No access to the New Grove Dictionary of Music online. No access to Knox's music, and obviously no Lexis or Westlaw. New York Public Library, a budget of over $300 million, only 7 to 8% of its annual budget is spent on acquisitions. JSTOR, ArtStore, Grove Dictionary, yes, they do have access to the electronic versions of them, but you have to go to the library in order to use it, completely defeating, in my mind, the purpose of these electronic versions. And certainly no Knox's music, and certainly no access to Lexis or Westlaw. My misgivings aside about the current state of public libraries, I am sanguine about their future, in large measure because I believe the non-rivalrous and intangible attributes of digital resources will ultimately promote changes in the allocation of public libraries' human and material resources that would allow them to become indistinguishable from academic research libraries, both in terms of breadth and depth of information resources available to all readers. And specifically, I think this would mean the gradual dismantling, literally and figuratively, of the public library as a physical location. In the future, if public libraries would shed their earthly coils and the panoply of social services and responsibilities that they've been saddled with, or they've saddled themselves with over the past 40 years, they could reallocate their resources to create a library of the future virtually indistinguishable from their academic counterparts. And specifically, they should, I believe, focus their resources on the creation, acquisition, distribution, and preservation of works in electronic form. Literacy programs should be, in my view, devoted to computer literacy programs, making everybody comfortable with the technology so that they can use it not merely in the library but at home, and promote the idea, finally, that the development of and access to intangible information resources are equally, if not more, valuable than traditional objects of philanthropic and eleemosynary work at libraries like building editions and book funds. In other words, to cultivate the spirit of Andrew Carnegie's in the digital age. I'll wrap up with that.
So I can see Charles and Josh could have an interesting conversation about the appropriate role of public libraries based on that. But I have the first question, and that goes to Ann in her capacity as the director of the MIT Press, and that is, it's very difficult, we know, to get a young scholar to get a monograph published with a prestigious press like MIT. How much more or less difficult might that be, do you suppose, 10 years from now?
The problem with scholarly monograph is not that it's not a perfectly worthy and appropriate genre for sharing an extended argument. The question is, who buys them? Because university presses, like commercial presses, are predicated on an assumption that money comes in to offset the costs of the staff who do the acquisitions, who design the product, who work with authors. Most authors I know who write books are pretty frank about the fact that they never would have gotten it done if they hadn't had a good editor. So there's design. Books are designed. It's hard to remember that you pick a typeface and the format on the page is selected and the cover is identified in indexes. And so there's a fair amount of labor that goes into creating a scholarly monograph, and then you have to figure out how to get to your markets, and there are lots of cheaper ways to do that today than mailing postcards to people, but in fact there are costs associated with producing a scholarly monograph, and they are editorial and they are interactive. So places like the MIT Press are looking at lots of options for managing down the costs associated with producing a scholarly monograph. They use every electronic tool they can find, but you still have to have some way of covering the costs unless you want a place like MIT to cover all the costs of production, in which case then you have a serious free rider problem, because as universities across the land shut down their university presses or trivialize them, and by reducing them to, this is going to offend somebody, regional publishing, you find that the avenues for scholarly monographs are smaller and smaller, and the economics of supporting scholarly monographic publishing are less and less. So I think unless we can collectively figure out how to support the cost of the enterprise, we will find ourselves in a position where those who have works they want to share in a genre known as the book, which supports an extended argument, that there will be no way to produce those. And even electronic publishing takes only a small percentage of the cost out of the book. You could go to print on demand, you could do lots, you could go to all ebooks, but you would still have the upfront costs associated with producing a high quality peer-reviewed scholarly monograph, even if you produce it electronically.
Thank you. Ann?
Charles got me to thinking about something that's been on my mind for the last year or so. So a comment and then a question. It seems to me that a very high calling, a very good goal for a large partnership would be that of making information, helping information to be widely available for our citizens. And Ann also touched on this. And I can imagine a partnership in which the public libraries, who know and interact with their clientele a whole lot in whatever ways, the academic libraries who know about ArtStore and JSTOR and have expertise in licensing and contact with publishers, and governments and funding agencies who can help make this happen could somehow collaborate for much broader access than we currently are providing in today's society. And that seems to me like something very much worth doing. I was wondering if any of the speakers know of such initiatives in any community, in any state, in any country of the world.
Well, I would say there are some states, until the current meltdown in tax revenue, that took it as their responsibility. I think here of Georgia, for instance, which the state of Georgia collaborated with public libraries and university libraries to license for every citizen in the state a set of electronic assets that look pretty much like what Charles was arguing for. The challenge is that the prices that publishers charge for electronic resources are staggeringly high, and they are monopolies for all intents and purposes. So to the extent that a large publisher will indeed give a discount to a state like Georgia to distribute resources to public libraries, university libraries, citizens in their home, it was a very interesting experiment, and my understanding it was very heavily used.
Well, I'm sorry to stand up again. I just kind of beg to differ at the slightly negative cast of that. I think that unless groups of us get together to try to make that kind of case and argument, we will always have reasons to not do it. And one of the biggest reasons will be that the publishers are big and nasty and charge a lot of money.
Well, you misunderstood me. You misunderstood
okay.
me. I was not saying
okay.
that there was a reason not to do it. I was saying
right, but that's one of the obstacles that maybe is removable, and we are managing to do it in developing countries. I wish we could do it in undeveloping countries. You know what I mean?
I think it's as I was suggesting, it's really, I think, heavily a matter of reallocation of resources. Why is it that universities do have access to some of these superb electronic resources? Is because there's a demand for it, and universities have decided to put their money, direct money toward it, and haven't decided to direct their money towards more frivolous things like flower arrangements.
John wants to get something in, and then Josh.
So, and first of all, we should have listened to you 5 years ago, and we should listen to you now. I think this is totally important, and we'll have the discussion later of the Google book settlement, which we actually, oddly enough, haven't really discussed in this panel, but I think it's sort of the elephant in the room in this respect. And I think the question of whether or not the Google book settlement precludes in any way, either de jure or de facto, some of the collaborations you're talking about, at least for some set of knowledge, is really an important question, and one of the ones that is most important to us. But I would also note that Ann, as director of the MIT Press, is a major part of this solution. The kinds of agreements, I'm an MIT Press author, that you have enabled us to do both as a journal article author and as a monograph author are great. And if every publisher were to follow Ann's lead, things would be a lot easier.
If I can just add for a second, at least from the New York Public Library perspective, because in one sense we are that kind of arrangement in that we're a public library that serves 3 of the 5 boroughs of New York City, an entire socioeconomic spectrum, and at the same time has really deep knowledge of the research needs and the research collections. It's not a matter of like institutional will or scraping up the money to do it or making that a priority. It's that the business model of institutional subscriptions is tailored to a very specific market, which is the university and higher education context, and a handful of corporations that have particular needs, which means that the model of paying per FTE or kind of in that vein fundamentally breaks when you look at the broad public access mandate of a public library. So, for example, at NYPL, you can get JSTOR in the building. You can't get it outside the building because when we go and try to figure out, okay, what would it cost, and you calculate on an FTE basis the entire population of even just Manhattan, and you notice that, and you think, okay, if NYPL offers that, then we've actually had cases where we've licensed subscriptions on a sort of borough-wide case, and NYU and Columbia and the dozens of other universities start dropping their subscription. So it's that there needs to be a paradigm shift to a sort of statewide or much like the unit of analysis of the institution is too small if you want to affect that broader change.
Okay, so we have to move on. There's 3 questions that we can have asked us. Have the questions asked one right after another, and then the panel will answer them. So in the interest of time, we've run out. So please.
I'm very glad to hear that these major libraries are committing to not just be collective bargaining agents to go and buy from a few corporations, but actually produce information services. And the steps that Harvard and MIT have made to go and push back on the journal publishers to create open access, I just say, thank goodness. And if I could ask Ann and John, just what were some of the politics and issues around it, and specifically from the perspective of, can we cause a movement here? Can other organizations that are, maybe not, can we get the rest of the universities copying your template, or what are they going to run into?
Next question.
I would first like to suggest that looking at the state of Delaware and the University of Delaware's partnership with the state libraries and the public libraries and the public schools is exactly what Ann was asking about. And UD LibSearch, the University of Delaware, does negotiate the licenses on behalf of the state, I believe, or at least that's how it was a couple of years ago when I worked there. And it increased the buying power and provided access to, you had a public library card in the state, you could access those databases. That's one solution. And I'm just curious, John, I think, was the only person who mentioned special collections, and I'm curious where rare books and archives fall in the rest of the panel's thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, great. Last question.
So I have a pro-consolidation question. Is there enough consolidation? The MIT issue of consolidation of faculty members really made me think of this. Should there be a cathedral called lawlibrary.com, which is the big library in the sky and leaves the bazaar for each individual library? And is it accreditation standards that limit the capacity of law schools to rationalize in terms of the organization and provision of services on a data basis?
Okay, great. Good 3 questions. So this first one is, what were the obstacles to open access? This is really John and Ann.
Well, maybe I can answer this because John's knowledge is probably, surely, let me pull the microphone. MIT addressed this issue across all the faculty, which made it an interesting question. Not that it's not interesting in law schools and in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. The obstacles were actually quite finite. One was, if you had a policy of this kind and a publisher refused to publish an article of a junior faculty member, would you be penalizing the junior faculty member's career if they couldn't publish in that journal? And we know that there are a number of journals who are adamantly committed to maintaining total control over the intellectual property that they publish. So that was one of the serious reasons for the waiver. You don't even have to you don't have to ask for the waiver, you get it automatically, but we do want people to ask us for it in writing, and we do want them to tell us why they're asking for it, because it's important to know if a particular article or a publisher or a group of publishers have a policy that says that they will not accept any article where there is a non-exclusive right granted to the university. So I would say that was one issue. And the other obstacle was that there are about 1,000 faculty members at MIT, which means there are about 1,200 opinions about what the right thing to do. They're not all economists, that's why it's such a low number. About what it is you're supposed to do with your work and how you can manage it and who owns it and what kind of trust and confidence you have in your host institution at any point in time, and concern for small publishers in academic disciplines where scholarly societies and associations manage most of the publishing. So again, the opt-out was envisioned as a way a faculty member could not put a small publisher, a small society publisher, in an awkward position if indeed it was problematic for them to publish in that place for whatever reason.
So Brewster, Ann has hit most of them. We did an FAQ of the responses, and I'm happy to share that to see, what were the arguments against it. The only one I would add, which I think may apply to everyone now, and even more so to non-Harvard and MIT instances, is cost. It does cost money on the part of the university to implement it in terms of staff and commitment and so forth, and that's a legitimate critique that Harvard and MIT can afford to do it. An analogous piece to that is some of the publishers then say, fine, you want to do it open access, give us $3 grand or whatever the cost is, the fee, right? And I think then a question for the university is, should you be paying that fee? Should you have a common pool of money to do it? And I think that gets into a really interesting question. But I admit that my fear, we made this commitment as a law school last May. I don't think any other law school has made a similar commitment of this breadth on terms of faculties. I'd be delighted to be corrected if I'm wrong. I'm worried that no one will follow us, right? And it may be that Harvard's in a position where we can do it for whatever reason, but I'm anxious that your problem gets solved. I'm delighted that MIT did it across all the faculties. I cannot imagine how Ann and others manage those politics, but it's thrilling. To the point about law schools working together, I think it's mostly been hubris that has kept us from collaborating in this particular way, honestly. And I think it's probably those of us like Harvard who compete or have competed in the size of our collection. We need to call that over. That's a dumb competition. We should compete on how good we are as collaborators to creating this new vision. And sign up with Blair and others. We need to do that.
And I think there's a lot more collaboration than people outside of the library world realize, that we do work together to share collections. So we've had ongoing for the past 20 years in the Northeast agreements on how to share foreign and international law collections, who has responsibility for collecting particular countries and so on. And we work with NELCO. I think Tracy Thompson might be in the audience. She's our executive director of NELCO, and she's done a lot of work. She's a Yale Law School graduate, done a lot of work towards getting law libraries to work together on a whole lot of fronts. But there's more that can be done there. On the special collections, yes. Yes, I think that all of us that have special collections, we see this as a big part of the future of print, that we're putting money into that area, that we're growing our special collections, that we're focusing on them for digitization projects. We're very proud of the special collections here. We've taken over special collections from other law libraries, so we've acquired huge parts of the rare book collection from libraries that care less about those collections. So thank you very much. We have to bring our session to a close.